Okay, welcome everybody. It's looks like 7 o'clock, so we'll get started here. Welcome to Savoy. Appreciate you guys showing up for our fourth event here. And hopefully you had time to go out and see a couple of the galleries that we've changed over since the last event here. So maybe you noticed the front runners that just showed up on Tuesday that are out there. And if you haven't been here since the last presentation, we also have the Pirelli exhibit, which is also new. So hopefully you guys got to see that. Also, guess I should introduce myself. I'm Bruce Patton, curator here at Savoy. And also wanted to mention tomorrow night, we have the Braves World Series trophy presentation here from 4 to 7. So it'll be out front. So you can just go there. I'm sure there'll probably be a line. So you can come up, get your picture taken with the World Series trophy. And we'll have some cars also, special cars out front for you guys to see too. So please make sure you come back tomorrow night. We got a great discussion tonight. We're going to do the Stout Scarab, and I'll let the experts here go into them. But as you know, there were 9 produced, and I think there's 5 left. And Ron here actually owns 2 of the 5 that are left. So we were talking about him having 40% of the cars that are available. But let me go ahead and introduce Ron. Ron Schneider, he's a lifelong automobile enthusiast. He operates his family business, which was founded 80 years ago. His primary interests include automotive industry, especially anything related to Ford Motor Company, those spanning from the mid-1900s to the present day. Most of the cars in Ron's pretty good-sized collection are Ford products, along with post-war sports and race cars. Ron has completed more than a dozen complete restorations in the past 50-plus years, and he has others that he's still working on also, like I'm sure everybody does, right? A member of numerous antique automobile clubs, as well as the Society of Automotive Historians. And as I mentioned, Ron has 2 of the 5 cars left. Also, we're lucky enough to have Ken Gross. Many of you guys have seen Ken here before. Ken is our guest curator. He helps us get these wonderful cars that are here. So really thank Ken for all of his work and helping us get the cars here for our special themes. You probably know before, but Ken has been the executive director of the Peterson Museum. He has 13 critically acclaimed automobile exhibitions at fine arts museums, and continuing on with more. Sounds like in the future too. 31-year Pebble Beach Concourse d'Elegance chief class judge and a member of the selection committee. Ken is the founding member of the International Chief Judges Advisory Group, and he judges at many North American and European concourse events. He's the author of 24 books and countless magazine articles. He's a recipient of the Automobile Hall of Fame Distinguished Service Citation and the International Motor Press Association Ken W. Purdy Award, the Motor Press Guild's Dean Bachelor Award, and the Lee Iacocca Award. And he currently lives with Trish there in Hamilton, Virginia. So welcome back, Ken. And I will now let those guys go ahead and go into the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. And thank you all for coming tonight. And special thanks to Ron Schneider, who drove down from Wisconsin and who kindly loaned us his one of his 2 Scarabs. And I guess what I'd like to start by saying is that the more you understand about Bill Stout and the Scarab, the more impressed you are. And we'll try to convey some of that this evening. Bill Stout as a where do we start with Bill? I mean, he invented this all-metal airplane, the Fokker triplane. How do you describe him as as an inventor and as really a genius.
Well, he was a visionary, I guess is a good way to put it, but I think he credited some of his ability on the fact that he was sickly as a kid and didn't do much. So he was indoors and it gave him time to think and do things. But he had the ability to look at an existing product and come up with an almost completely brand new idea on how to do it without really owing anything to previous design at that point. Having had the chance to actually speak with some people who worked with him, because I started this project 35 years ago. There were a few people still living who actually worked with him. And one told me that every day when he came in, he had another new idea about something. And they might have been working on several things in the shop, but he always had a brand new idea. And he is credited with inventing the term Imagineering, which Walt Disney Corporation uses all the time. But his background in aircraft, because aviation was a brand new thing at the time. He was born in 1880, so by the time aviation came around, he was there for the start of it. And he understood the problems with aviation, which in the early days had to do with weight of the vehicle, of the airplane, and the lack of power, and so he addressed that. He thought that there were a lot of things that required his attention.
Well, before we get into airplanes, let's show them a couple of other things that he invented.
Oh, yeah.
He didn't invent the motorcycle, but he certainly perfected it. This is the Victor that he, and a variation on this, he and his wife went to Europe and toured around with. And next to that, of course, is the Scripps Booth Automobile, a lightweight car with a number of innovative ideas for the time. And now we can get into airplanes a little, Ron. I'm showing a picture here of the Air Sedan. And as Ron said, Stout understood intuitively that making an airplane out of wood was subject to all the problems that wood have. So we could talk a little about how he developed the metal airplane.
Well, he understood in the early days the service life of an aircraft was about 6 months, because they were outside, and if the elements didn't get to them, they probably crashed. So this was a problem. And he thought there was a way to use aircraft commercially. And one of his sayings was that an airplane must be able to support itself in the air financially. So he reasoned that an all-metal airplane would last a lot longer than a wood and fabric airplane. And he was asked one time to address a meeting of aircraft engineers, and he was the guest speaker, and everybody knew his position on airplanes. So his opening remarks, he said, "Wood veneer is a perfectly good material to make an airplane out of." And everybody kind of stopped, because this was not what he had been saying. He said, "The only problem is, after a while, it develops venereal disease." So that placed mistrust of the material. Plus, he said, metal, you can estimate the strength of metal within 2-3%, but you can't estimate the strength of wood without breaking it. That's not a real scientific way to do this. But he did prove you could make an all-metal airplane that would work. And he actually ran the first commercial passenger-carrying airline with Ford tri-motors, and it made 2 trips a day, Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, back to Detroit.
I'm trying to show the tri-motor, but I don't seem to have action here. But before I do, Ron, let me just interrupt you for 2 seconds. Look at the skid in the tail. There's no tail wheel on this airplane, because they believed that brakes on an airplane would cause it to nosedive. So when they did land, they skidded along on this tail skid until it worked. So there we go. There's the Stout Airlines that Ron is talking about, and the tri-motor. And when Stout did this, his reasoning was, 2 engines are good, 3 are even better. And Ron can tell you a little more about Stout Airlines and his Imagineering of the passengers flying from city to city.
Well, they built 199 Ford tri-motor airplanes. Ford Motor Company bought Stout's all-metal airplane company in, I think, 1926. And Henry Ford, when he got interested in something, he just threw himself completely into it. So Stout was basically out of the engineering part of it, but he stayed on to help promote aviation at the time. And the plane is extremely well made. There are no structural failures on tri-motors to my knowledge after all these years. Yes, some of them did crash. It happened, weather-related pilot error, but none of them simply fell apart in the air, which is a problem with Tony Foker's tri-motor that Newt Rockney was killed in when the plane simply came apart. Airplanes don't fly good unless all the parts are right where they should be. But I've studied these airplanes because it's one of my favorite airplane designs. Now, I am not a pilot, but anything mechanical is fair game to me. I did do a flight school at the Experimental Aircraft Association on the Ford Tri-Motor. We spent a weekend studying it, learning about it, pre-flighting it, and then we went up in the aircraft on a crisp Sunday, December morning. And once in the air, they let us all fly it. And I flew the aircraft. It's kind of heavy, clunky plane, but it's very easy to fly if you like flying. I'm not fond of flying because it isn't fun anymore to me. But as long as you can manage to keep the horizon in front of you and level, because if you start to see too much ground, you're in trouble. If you start to see too much sky, you're in trouble. So as long as you can do that, you can get along real fine. I just find, for me, flying, the act of doing it is a little boring. But that's my opinion on it. But the tri-motor served the industry well until about 1932. Boeing came out with their 247, which was a more advanced aircraft. And then Douglas came out with the DC-2, which became the DC-3, which are still being used in commercial aviation today, all these years later. And in Oshkosh, there's a company called Basler Air that rebuilds DC-3s for various people and upgrades them. But that's a pretty fabulous aircraft for what it was designed to do and still does. But then Stout decided by 1932 that the automobile industry needed his help. So he got started on his idea for a modern, improved automobile, which became the Scarab.
Well, before we show you that, let us show you a couple of other Bill Stout inventions. He loved the notion of lightweight stress construction, and so he worked with Pullman on a lightweight train he called the rail plane. There it is. And you see how modern it looks compared with steam engines of that era. And here are, before Bill Stout got into the automobile, here are just a few of the things that he looked at. Better ways to do automobiles, better ways to do buses, certainly better ways and more affordable ways to do airplanes, a commuter plane, if you will. He got into buses, as you can see. And this is the Stout Club car. It's an early self-propelled motorhome. I don't know where the Winnebago people were when this came out, but obviously Stout was a visionary. He even invented a folding house trailer that would unfold. Ron has one of these and says it works just fine. And it could be towed, in this case, by a 35 Ford. And it could be set up very simply. You see the sides expand, so it's much bigger than a conventional trailer that would look the same when it's being towed down the road. And finally, here it is at the Greenbrier being set up. And I promised you we're going to get to the cars in a second, but we just wanted you to see how immensely creative Mr. Stout was. He wrote a wonderful book. You can still buy it on Amazon. It's not very expensive, about his inventions. And curiously, he doesn't mention very much about the Stout Scarab car. We're going to tell you more about the car tonight than is in Stout's book.
Let me interject just for a moment. The last project he was working on before his death was an ornithopter. And that's a vehicle that flies by flapping its wings. And I am told he had a motorcycle-sized model that worked. But I don't know what happened to it. And When I was in contact with the grandchildren, they weren't sure either. But that's a dream that goes back too, having an airplane that can fly by flapping its wings. But I wouldn't put it past them to have actually made it work.
So he made everything work that he tried, it seemed. And here's his first effort with the, I'm stymied by this clicker, I'm afraid. There we go. Perhaps Ron can tell us a little about the original Scarab, the prototype, which is on the left, and then the car on the right, which is very similar to what we have here.
Well, the car on the left was in the industry, they would call it a test mule. They were trying to see, would the basic ideas work? So this is rear-engined, although the drivetrain is engine transmission differential, so it intruded into the cabin. And you'll see later what they did to solve that problem, because they tried to save as much space as possible to make the car as big on the inside without making it too big on the outside. So I have pictures of that car with 1934 Michigan license plates on it. And in order trying to achieve a good ride, they put aircraft tires on it, big balloon aircraft tires, so that the tires would absorb more of the road shocks, which is something we have gotten away from today. Tires don't absorb too many road shocks anymore, since their sidewall is not very
They're too
very
thin
tall.
to do that.
So, so that car did operate, it did run. There were rumors it was still around, but I've never been able to find it. It's not real pretty. I don't think they could have sold that very well, because they couldn't sell the Scarab very well, mainly because of its cost. This car, on the right, this Scarab was the prototype Scarab in its final form. Stout drove this car a lot. Up until after World War II, he always had a Scarab to drive. I mean, he believed in what he was doing, and people would say they would see him in the Detroit area actually driving the car. So there's a lot of detail changes on this car from this to the production.
Blake, wherever you are, I think I need your help.
Scarabs are all built to the same basic spec. No two seem to be precisely alike, but the production cars all look like this.
It should be.
There are detail changes and whatnot, and they
Yeah.
got a lot of good press at
Right.
the time.
Oh.
But this car is really a little too radical compared to what else was available. See, and Stout's lament was the industry, the automobile industry, all they did was copy each other. If somebody came out with a design that worked, the next year everybody copied it. And he said, we should stop doing that, we should innovate. I mean, he said the engine's in the front of the car for the simple reason that the horse would be in the front of the buggy. He said, we put the engine in the back, get to wave it over the driving tires for better traction, get the noise and any smell of it behind you. And also, by doing that, this car has got basically twice the interior space of a Chevrolet or a Ford, and if you measure it on the outside, it's about the same size as a Chevrolet or a Ford. It's very usable inside, and that's what he was trying to accomplish with it. He wanted to make a better car, and he was kind of chiding the industry to follow his lead. Stop doing what you're doing, think a little more, let's make things better, which is what he did.
Take a look at this for a moment, this cutaway, because you see several things that made the Scarab so unique in its era. Look where the wheels are. They're in the corners. The floor is flat. The seating arrangement is remarkable. I mean, it's like being in your dining room or your living room. And as Ron said, the engine is way in the back, so you can't really hear it. The car has better traction on wet weather because the engine is right over the wheels. If we can. And of course, easy access. There's a passenger door on the right-hand side of the car and a single door for the driver on the other side. And Stout worked really hard to sell this car. As you'll see a little bit later on, there are advertisements. There'll be a major position in Fortune magazine, for example. He believed in this car, but we don't know how hard he really tried to sell it. What do you think, Ron?
Well, in my experience, inventors like inventing things. And then usually the goal is invent it, prove it'll work, sell it to somebody who will build them. That's how Stout would try and finance his experiments and whatnot. And he tried to sell the Scarab this concept to Packard. Packard looked at it, but it wasn't really for them. Because again, what we're looking at here, this car has no separate fenders, and every car had separate fenders. This has no running boards, so every car had running boards. It doesn't have really any kind of a hood on it, because the didn't need the hood to cover the engine. That's all in the back. And one side benefit of the rear engine is that you don't need power steering. The car steers very easy. It's a very nice steering car because you don't have the weight of the engine on the front tires. To him, it was also a safety factor because you sat further forward in the car, you had better visibility. So there's many little things that maybe didn't seem apparent, but they all fit together real well on the car. The car's shape, people say it's streamlined. Well, that was not their concept. They wanted to build a car that was smooth and would have minimum outside wind noise. So we have this smooth shape. We have flush window glass. Gee, all cars today have flush window glass. We have hidden door hinges, so they couldn't protrude into the airstream. It doesn't have door handles. It has push-button electric door locks. And it also has an extremely effective flow-through ventilation system. The Scarab on the front has the wings of the Beetle. Those are actually louvers and vents. When the car is moving, the air is directed through a register on top of the instrument panel towards the ceiling and out the back window. So if you happen to be a smoker in the car, the smoke simply rose and got sucked out the back.
It's literally flow-through ventilation.
It is a flow-through ventilation. And we've used it in the desert in some really hostile situations. As long as it's moving, it's comfortable. Once you stop, yeah, it gets warm. So the idea is keep moving. But these are things that were styled into it, but everything's functional. Every little thing had a particular purpose in the design. The most unfunctional things are probably the headlight grills. But you have to have something frivolous, I guess, just to keep people's attention.
We're going to show you a number of the details, but if you look at the rear view here, not only is it a wonderful Art Deco look, but you can see the hood flaps at in the corners. When you release those, the hood comes up like butterfly wings on both sides. And I can't resist showing you this because Ron has been kind enough to loan his car, as has Larry Smith, another Scarab owner. And our museum here doesn't suffer from a freight elevator, but this is what happens when you have an art museum with an elevator. There's not a lot of room on either side of that Scarab, but we did get it in and we got it up to the second floor. And Ron mentioned aerodynamics. I mean, in a manner of speaking, this is a sleek, neat car. But most importantly, the interior, and we'll have Ron talk a little bit about that.
Well, he wanted the interior to be comfortable and functional. And as a result, it has a table, which was kind of a novelty, but he said you could use that to play cards or checkers or have lunch. The individual seats, other than the driver's seat, which is on an adjustment mechanism, the other two individual seats are loose on the floor. They also recline. Strangely enough, they don't move around when you're driving. In normal driving, they just stay put, whether anyone's in them or not. And Stout bragged the car was so smooth in ride and so stable that you could put a glass of water on the table and drive cross country and not spill it. Well, he was pretty close. We used to, when we were on the Great Race, which is at the time, it probably still is a little bit of a circus act. There was all the promotion and whatnot. Well, when we came into town, we filled a glass with water and put it on the instrument panel. And the guy who promoted the race in the first place knew the story, so he would make a big deal out of reaching in and saying, since they left New York, this glass of water has been on the top of the instrument panel and hasn't spilled a drop. Well, not entirely true, but close enough for what they were doing.
So one of the things we didn't mention earlier is Ron said that almost nothing about this car was like a conventional car, and it had four-wheel independent suspension with some rubber springing that helped make for a fairly decent ride, right?
Well, it might have been, other than maybe Mercedes, it was probably the only production car in the world that had four-wheel independent suspension for a road car. And with the long wheelbase and the suspension the way it was, it does ride very nice. It's a very nice driving, comfortable car. I mean, one of the things when we decided to go on the great race was, well, we should have a car that's comfortable. You know, we're driving 1930s cars, 3,000 miles, so maybe we should be comfortable. So that worked real good for us, and its design, its mechanical design was meant to work, be user-friendly, be fun to travel in, and they are. I mean, the impetus in me restoring the car was there were none you could drive, and I really wanted to drive one, and there weren't any that were functional. So that kept me going because I wanted to find out, did everything Bill Stout say, was it true? Did it work? Or was it just salesman's hype? I'd have to say it was pretty darn close to being spot on the truth as far as that went.
Well, and you took it on the great race. So
yeah, twice.
At a pretty level,
Once wasn't
good
enough.
level of reliability as well. It's pretty fabulous.
In all the years I've had the car and driven it, we've never had to get towed home. I mean, it's always been reliable. The unusual parts of the car, features, for the most part, don't offer any trouble. Any of the car's problems are the same as other cars of that era, as far as mechanically. You know, maybe a fuel pump or a generator, but that's just the way that stuff was. We'll backtrack just for a second. The engine covers, the employees at Stout referred to them as coattails. They weren't the hood, they weren't the engine cover, they were a coattail. Probably thinking of a morning coat, is that right, with the tails? Tuxedo, black tie.
Would you tell everyone about how you found a second Scarab and we're going to use it as a parts car until you decided it was too valuable and too important?
Well, the first car I acquired from a friend of mine, and it was in really deplorable condition. Many missing things, it just was a sad car. There was nothing to go on, nobody could tell you anything. And through a series of events, I got in touch with the fellow who owned this car. He had bought this car from the Hera collection when they were dismantling the collection. And he had heard about me, but he didn't know who I was. A friend of mine happened to meet the guy at a car swap meet. One thing led to another, and I called him, and he said, "Is your car as bad as mine?" I said, "Probably worse." He said, "Are you missing anything?" I said, "Well, there's a list." So we discussed it. He said, "I'll send you pictures." So he did. Well, then he sent me some parts, which I didn't expect. And we got to talking, and he said to me, "You know, I think I may sell it because I don't think I can restore it." And I said, "Well, if you want to sell it, I'm interested. Come up with a price. We'll see if we can do something." Because my thought was, if I buy this, it could be a parts car for the other one, which is a common thing in restoration anyway. You get a parts car to help you with your main project. Well, we got it home, and I began to find out very quickly that parts were not interchangeable. Only some mechanical bits in the doors. But the coattails are not interchangeable. There are 1-inch differences with things between the cars because the frame tubing is 1-inch square. So they might locate one in a little different spot from the other one. So this was a little disappointing, but I thought, well, okay, you know, this is the hand we're dealt, so let's do it. So when I got started restoring this car, we actually had the two of them side by side for a lot of fabricating, measuring, and we used this car for the most part as a model for the other one, and then some things on the other one we used as a model on this one. So that's the way that all began to happen. And you know, you do reach a point where you say, well, maybe it's going to beat me, but can't let that happen. And people would say, well, is it hard to find parts? I said, no, not really, because there aren't any parts, so you make parts. But strangely enough, some of the production items on the car this past year at Hershey, I found two Stout Scarab parts for the other car that I was missing. Underseat heater assembly and the proper horn button. But you got to know what you're looking for. So to come back from Hershey with two parts for a Stout Scarab is a little unusual. But
I think it's fair to say, and hope Ron would agree, that Bill Stout believed in this car. If we can change our slide here, one more. He actually paid, or his company paid, to run advertisements in magazines like Fortune, and he challenged the big three. He said, this is what the car of the future looks like, and this is what you will be making someday. We'll show you a slide toward the end that he was right. He just was decades away from being correct. But this was a pretty bold thing to do. He talked about the features, saying these features are standard on this car, and someday you'll be adopting them. But it took a long time.
he challenged the industry and said they'll all be building this in 3 or 4 years.
Yes.
Well, not exactly.
It was a little bit longer. Why do you think he called it a scarab? Was it the shape?
Well,
and
there's a couple of things. One, a scarab is a beetle. It's an Egyptian beetle. They were regarded by the ancient Egyptians as being a sign of creativity and great learning. But insects, beetles, many insects, their shell is their skeleton. They live inside their skeleton.
like an exoskeleton, in
An
essence.
exoskeletal car. Well, the Scarab, if you were to take all the body panels off this car, it would be a skeleton that would look the same as it looks now.
We'll show you that in a moment. Yep.
So that plus the fact it's not something you might forget. And yes, it does look like a bug. And then that one, for the second time on the Great Race, I thought maybe I should try and get some sponsorship. I thought maybe Orkin might be interested, but we never went that far.
Let's show you what it looked like on the road in the 1930s. It's a wonderful piece of footage that shows the Scarab. Now this one has 44 headlights. As Ron said, they're all different, and this has a different bumper guard. But here you are inside the car on a road. We think that's Detroit. Looks like the winter because the trees are pretty bare. But we found this on YouTube, and it's really quite fascinating. It must have been a promotional film to show people and say, look, this is for real. And here it is, humming along.
That's exactly what it looks like when you're riding in it. Just like that. You know, when you're riding in the car, you cannot see any part of the outside of the car.
And there were no mirrors originally. This car has an external mirror, but there were no outside mirrors, I don't think, in the beginning. We'll show you this again because it's just too wonderful. Whoop, no, never mind. We're on to the interior once again. Very much like the early minivans. Bruce, we can kind of go through each of these kind of slowly here. The car was demonstrated all around the country. I'm sure people looked at it, but one of the difficulties was that this was a $5,000 car in an era where a new Ford sedan might be around $600. You could probably buy a decent Cadillac in the $1,300 to $1,500 range. Maybe a Pierce Arrow was $2,000. I mean, Duesenbergs were in this kind of range, but this was $5,000 might have been the sticking point, despite the fact that until the Nash Ambassador came along, you couldn't do this in your car. And here you see the wings opening in the back and the Ford flathead engine. The next picture will show you this skeleton that Ron mentioned. Again, in this era, cars were a body on a chassis, and here this is so different in this era. And I think the next shows you how this is a Ford flathead, and the transmission is underneath it, and there's a chain drive to fairly simple to make it work. So how does it shift, Ron?
That's probably the only negative thing in the car. The shift, you need a firm hand. It's a little stiff, only because it's operating a bunch of linkages and things. But otherwise, it's a standard 3-speed, and it once you get used to that, it's just fine because most of your driving would be in third gear anyway. But to backtrack slightly to the interior, Stout tried different things to try and make the car more friendly to be used. one of the cars on the right side had a panel, a padded panel that you could fold up, and he said this would make into a berth. And I told the story at a show one time, and I said this was effected by use, and these were his words. He said, "You effect this by use of the berth control handle." And there was a woman looking at the car, and she was real indignant. And she looked at me and says, "They didn't have berth control back then." So.
So here's the engine. If you're familiar with Ford flatheads, it's your basic flathead, except it's mounted backwards compared to the way a car would normally be, and sitting above the transmission.
That whole drivetrain is on its own subframe. And by undoing the linkage in 8 bolts, you can pick the car up by its rear bumper, take the entire drivetrain out on its wheels and tires. The idea was if there were enough of these in service, the service life of most cars back then was about 50,000 miles. But you could bring your car to your local Stout Scarab dealer, and he would exchange your drivetrain for a remanufactured drivetrain, and they would reline your front brakes, put 2 new tires on the front, and you had a brand new car again.
And here's the second video we found of the Scarab in action here, trundling across uneven ground.
Watch how smooth it really is.
And the proud inventor himself. Any idea which one this is, Ron?
This is most likely serial number 1 because of some different features on it. The front fenders are skirted down more over the tires. The gas filler cap is on the right side instead of the left. And if you can look at the rear, the grill is pinched just a little bit more. Again, a styling thing. So I'm guessing that's number 1, which eventually they took the mechanical parts out of it to make the last Scarab development.
So let's tell everyone who bought these cars, that we know anyway.
Well, it's hard to track all of them, but most of the owners of the cars were either friends of Stouts or investors. Willard Dow from Dow Chemical got the first one, which we believe that would be car number 2, with that still exists. This car was owned by Robert Stranahan, who was president of Champion Sparkplug. The Harvey Firestone Sr. owned one. One car was sold overseas to France, owned by the editor of a French newspaper called Le Temps. He was a car enthusiast. I don't know his name. There are quite a few service records because most cars in the area went back to Stout for service, but they're only identified by a serial number. It doesn't say whose car it was. Philip Wrigley, I shouldn't leave him out. He was a good friend of Stout's, a frequent investor with him, and he had one that was retrimmed and repainted that was going to go to the Chicago Auto Show to promote the car at the auto show for the following year of 1937. And then they abandoned that idea. So he took the car in exchange for the $8,000 worth of Stout Motor Car Company stock that he had invested. And he kept that car until 1964. And he gave the car to the Detroit Historical Museum, which is where it is today. I actually drove that car when it turned 10,000 original miles. For a while they had it functional, but it's just a static display now.
And where does Major Bose fit into the picture?
Well, the story was Major Bose owned this car at one time, but I don't believe that. There's been no substantial evidence, although Major Bose was a car enthusiast. Mm-hmm. He had
Is he a radio personality or something?
No,
like that?
Major Bose Original Amateur Hour.
Oh, there you go.
We often wondered how many young lady talents he might have interviewed in this car, but that was just some speculation on our part. He may have owned one, but the Harvey Firestone car ended up with Al Pierce, who was a radio personality in the 30s and fairly well known. And that car went back to Stout and was some slight mechanical modifications, and they repainted the thing banana yellow with a dark red
when we have
rocker
a picture
panel.
of that.
We have a picture of that car. It was pretty striking, certainly for that time. But Stranahan, I had to say, I believe he had two sons who were maybe best described as the sons of a wealthy man. Well, they had been reading all the great things Stout said about the car, and Stout said, you can drive this car across a plowed field at 50 miles an hour. So they did. They drove this car across the plowed field. Then after they rolled it over, because they did, Stout got a call Monday morning saying the car is in a field at such and such. So he sent a couple guys out and he said, see if you can get it back here. And they did. It was on its side. They righted the car. They actually drove it back to the engineering lab. And this answered the question to me of why there was some weird repair in the upper right corner, which was covered. And we couldn't imagine what could have happened because there's a triangular piece of bracing metal up there on both sides. It has to be 1/4 of an inch or better thick. And that had been fixed. That's when I believe this car got repainted and trimmed the way it is today. Because I have pictures of this car from about 1940, 41. And it is this car because there's a distinguishing feature that we could see. And it was still in Stranahan's ownership at that point. Right after the war, everything changed because if you were a car manufacturer, no matter what you built, somebody would buy it because we were starved for new automobiles. So the Scarab was probably pretty quickly forgotten. However, Stout had one more design up his sleeve. We'll get to that.
You might rightfully ask, was anyone else trying anything like this? The answer is sort of not really. Here's a Martin Aerodyne from 1928. We've got a Dymaxion that Buckminster Fuller, who was friends with Bill Stout, did. You've probably seen one of these before. This next car we really don't know much about at all. Unusual teardrop shape, and that's true for this one. And in the meantime, here was Mr. Stout getting great publicity for his car, and people admired it. People understood the engineering. They saw some of these advantages. But unfortunately, there were very few. I think one more, Bruce. Jeff Hacker, who's a lover of unusual cars, who has the Forgotten Fiberglass website, described it as an Art Deco loaf of bread, which might be a little unkind. Buddy L. at the time, who did all the trucks and toys for boys and girls, they had a Scarab toy. The car got its share. People knew about it, I think, and we can show you like one more. Like nothing else on the road. So you wonder, after the war, what was Bill Stout thinking? They didn't want this car, perhaps they'd want another. So we'll show you this, and Ron can tell you a little about the post-war car and its fiberglass body.
Well, this car was commissioned by Owens Corning to explore using plastics in automobiles on a much greater level than just door handles, doorknobs, choke knob, whatever. There's 8 basic fiberglass pieces. It's a unit body car in fiberglass. Now it has the same basic mechanical layout as the other Scarabs. They used components of Stout's own Scarab, the prototype or number 1, incorporated into this car. Now this car, besides being fiberglass, it had another feature. It had rubber airbag suspension at all 4 corners, which were inflated, were made by Firestone. Firestone made the rubber airbags on GMC motorhomes. If you remember the GMC motorhome from the 70s, where it has 2 rear wheels on each side, and there's an airbag between them. Air suspension probably gives you the nicest ride of any medium like that. Citroën used something similar for quite a few years. I don't know what they're doing today. I never can keep up with the French, especially Citroën. But the car, talking again to people who work for Stout, the car was very nice, and it drove nice and comfortable and all that. But they said for some strange reason, it seemed if the car happened to get a flat tire at one corner, that airbag went flat too. So now the thing's really on the ground. They'd have a lot of trouble trying to get it up high enough to change a tire and then repair the airbag. So they tried this on one like this, but it ended up on this car. One difference in the mechanicals, this car uses a 6-row chain, like a big wide bicycle chain, to actually drive the rear wheels. This car used V-belts, like fan belts, which would be quieter and require no lubrication and less maintenance. Stout drove this car about 250,000 miles post-war.
250,000 miles. I mean, fairly impressive. He certainly believed, and only one was built, Ron, right?
Just the one. Kaiser Fraser was involved. They would have built the car if it were going to go into production. This car exists. It's owned by the Detroit Historical Museum. Here it's been on display at the Gilmore Museum in Hickory Corners, Michigan. It's been freshened up a little bit. They should have left it alone. But when he gave this car to Detroit Historical, they also got a lot of documentation of whatnot from him. But he told them at the time, you should try and find one of the original ones because that was the more significant design. That's the way he described it. And he was right. Like I say, the fiberglass car was done to try and test fiberglass. At any event, they asked him, well, where can we find one? And he says, I don't know. He said, Philip Wrigley had one. Why don't you call him and see what he knows what happened to his car? So they called Philip Wrigley, and they said, can you tell us where Stout Scarab is? What happened to it? He says, well, it's in my garage at Lake Geneva at my summer estate. Eventually, after a few years, they put together a deal, and he donated the car to them, and it's still there today. It's the lowest mileage, most original existing Scarab, because they only use it in the summertime. They call it their beach car. That's how they referred to it. And it was at Detroit Historical for a particular exhibit. They wanted to get it to run. They hired a friend of mine to do the mechanical work and had it running. And that was my first chance to drive one, because this wasn't done yet. But after driving it, my single most impressive, shall we say, sensation about the car was it seemed extremely solid and very stable. Because when you think about it, there's nothing on this car that can come loose and flap around or make noise. Everything is fastened to that frame. So it's not like having a Model T Ford where everything vibrates, because that's just the way they were. So I was impressed with it, and then that spurred me on to get this thing done.
So this is where we want you to kind of think backward, rearward, in the rearview mirror a little bit, looking at the Scarab, and then look at something like the Volkswagen Microbus, and even more importantly, look at the next slide. And there it is. Now, we've had, Ron has taken this car everywhere. People commented on it. I've had it in several museums. And when you tell people that it was the forerunner of the minivan, you can see the lights go on. They get it. They understand. People in 1934, 5, 6 didn't quite understand it. They had no basis of comparison. But when they see this, they understand what a pioneering effort the Scarab was. Really just a remarkable car for its time.
We had the car at Meadowbrook Hall, Concord, and
the lights on it.
A lot of, because it's Detroit area, you get a lot of people from the automobile industry there. And 2 executives from Chrysler happened to be at this particular show, and they were looking at this thing very carefully. And as they walked away, the one said to his partner, so who's going to tell Lee Iacocca he didn't invent the minivan?
Yeah. And it's interesting, too, when you think about the minivan. We're going to rotate this so you can see the inside. Hal Sperlich at Ford originally tried to sell the idea of the minivan to Henry Ford, who poo-pooed it and said no one will ever buy it. Sperlich was a friend of Lee Iacocca's, and at Chrysler, in some of the desperation of the K car and everything else, they grabbed at this particular straw, and I think I have to hold this to do it, and it worked, obviously. But there was the idea in 1936, all set up to happen. You'll notice some of the interesting things about this car. I think you can see the headliner is like a kind of lattice work. It's just really very cool.
It's a woven wicker.
Wicker, yeah.
We on a practical basis, it conforms very easily to the inside curves of the roof. I think they did it mainly because, as a throwback to the early days of aviation, they used wicker seats in planes because they were light. Lindbergh Spirit of St. Louis had a wicker seat. The very first passenger Stout aircraft had wicker seats, which makes some sense. The original headliner was damaged and not usable, and I was trying to decide what to do about it, and somebody suggested, why don't you find somebody who does chair caning? So I found a woman who did chair caning, and I explained what I was doing, and I brought it out to show it to her, and she said, well, you know, if somebody did this, I suppose I can do it. So it took her about 6 months. And I called her one day, and I said, how you coming with the headliner? She says, I had it all done, but there was a little accident. She had pet bunnies, these flop-eared rabbits, and one of them got at it and chewed the corner off it. So she had to redo that corner of it. By the way, Henry Ford II did not like anything but big, expensive luxury cars. He didn't like trucks. He was very bullheaded that way. So there you go. They could have had the first minivans.
They certainly could.
They could have had a suburban type car, but they never did.
If you look inside under the dash where the heater is, you'll see an elliptical shaped gray and red S&W South Wind heater. And those are gasoline powered. So you have the opportunity to blow your car up from the inside. Do you ever use that, Ron? Does it work?
Yeah, it was a brand new one in the box, and I put it in because
no one wanted to buy them.
And it actually it's very safe because if the engine quits running, the heater quits working because it gets its fuel from the engine, and it has a very tiny motor and fan in it, which doesn't seem to blow very hard. But when it's operating, it's operating at 400 degrees. So it'll cook you out of there.
It doesn't blow up.
But you see, the other thing is the exhaust on it is vacuum to the engine. So no vacuum or no fuel, then it wouldn't run. It'll cook your shoe leather. I had that experience one time. I was trying to get the whole experience of what it was like to live with one of these. You know, cold weather, hot weather, whatever. And when you're on the Great Race, we had every weather you could imagine. It rained cats and dogs, hotter than all get out in the desert, crossing the Continental Divide in a sleet storm. And there's no defrosters on this, so that was a bit of a challenge. But yeah, the Southwind heater was a good thing, and yeah, they probably got some bad press. You know, it's like a Model A Ford with a gas tank in your lap, which there's no known cases of a problem with that, but you are sitting with 11 gallons of gas on top of your legs. You don't think about that. Sometimes you don't think about those things.
But before we open it for questions, have we forgotten anything about Bill Stout? Any anecdotes or thoughts about him? I do commend that book, if you can find a copy of it. It's absolutely fascinating. But
So Away I Went, yeah, it's a good read, easy read. He basically covers everything in his career at that point. As I say, I was fortunate to meet some members of the family. He had 4 grandchildren, 2 boys, 2 girls. The older daughter, who basically the two granddaughters, I got a letter one day, and because I had met both of them, and I got a letter, and the younger one said, we have one of Bill Stout's folding trailers. She said, it needs a lot of work or the dump. Are you interested in it? I said, of course I'm interested. So we went and got it. But in talking to the older granddaughter, I said, well, you had experience with your grandfather. What did you think of him? And she said, well, I got the impression he didn't like kids very much. And yet he did a lot of things with his grandchildren. They built a huge toboggan run at the house north of Detroit, which went onto a lake. And so, you know, the kids would ride the toboggan down the hill, past the boathouse, and as far out into the lake as they could possibly go. He also invented we have super soakers, you know, the kids use. Well, he had a water cannon he made for the oldest grandson, which I suppose somebody didn't like that, but I'm sure it was a lot of fun. He died in 1956, so of course I never met him. But all but the youngest grandchild knew him because they were alive when he was around. He retired to Phoenix, had a small engineering lab there, and that's where he worked until his death. I'm trying to think,
He learned to fly airplanes because he was so involved with the metal airplane. He felt that it was important that he knew how to fly so he'd know the various characteristics that an airplane did. And that flying in those days took a pretty intrepid soul to take a plane up.
Well, he said there was an older married couple who loved flying, and they would go with them any chance they got. And he said, many flights ended up in a bad landing or a forced landing or something you wouldn't want to have happen. And they had a bad landing, and after everything stopped moving around, he looked at this couple and they were sitting there laughing hysterically. They thought this was just funny as could be to have this happen. So, that was a big adventure. Let's face it, we're going up into the air with something that might be unreliable. It's one thing to have your car quit and you pull over and get out and hitchhike. In the air, you don't do that. That's a serious, serious business. And I flew with my father many times. I'll tell you one cute story about that. My younger brother, we go down to the airport one day. He's going to take him up in the plane, and my brother gets in and goes and sits in the back. He's probably 6 years old. My dad says, "Why don't you come sit up front with me?" No, he said, I'll stay back here. So they're taxiing, getting ready to take off. He's waiting in the pattern, and he says, "Come on, sit up here, you can see better." He says, "No," he says, "if this thing cracks up, I'm safer back here." That was his whole take on it. So,
can we answer any questions? But Ron is probably the only living person who's driven a Scarab as much, has owned two of them, and as you can see, this was a very inventive, ahead of its time vehicle. What would you like to ask us?
I say we have two microphones. We're going to have one for the top and one here for the bottom. Just raise your hand and I'll bring over the microphone.
Here's somebody in front.
We had the Tucker here, and we had the Tucker grandchildren here, and I see a lot of similarities in rear engine and things like that. How do they compare, Tucker versus Stout?
well, I don't know of direct comparisons. The Tucker is certainly an interesting design. It had a few faults because I don't think they had enough time to develop everything. I've never driven a Tucker. I find them kind of fascinating. I had a chance some years ago to buy one. I probably should have. But that car gets a bad rap for no good reason. Preston Tucker gets a bad rap for no good reason. They said he was a charlatan and a phony, but he really, I think, he wanted to build those cars. And, the car business is big win, big lose. You either have the money and you make something that you can make money with, and if you don't, we know what's happened to all the underfinanced companies that couldn't quite get the job done or didn't have anything that was particularly special. But the same idea, rear engine, put the engine over the driving wheels for greater traction. And Tucker had his safety things about the car. I don't know if there's anything safe about this. Well, like I told a friend of mine, he was going to...
I've driven several Tuckers, and I put together the Tucker class of 14 cars we had at Pebble Beach a few years ago. Francis Coppola, when he did the movie, invited a group of journalists, I was lucky to be one of them, to drive his car and George Lucas's car. We had one at the Peterson. I've driven one with Mark Lieberman. And what I can say about the Tucker, and I've driven this briefly, nowhere near as much, but it was a design that needed a great deal more development. And they really ran out of time when the SEC started investigating Preston Tucker. The factory records went away. They just weren't ready. But what's interesting is Tucker has had a tremendous amount of publicity over the years. And the movie did a great deal. If there ever were a Scarab movie, I think more people would know about this wonderful car. But certainly the movie put Tucker on the map.
All I can say about this car, it only really has, in my opinion, as a car, it has really no faults, except its rear visibility is not real good, but cars of that era did not have good visibility anyway. And an outside mirror is kind of necessary in today's world, but back then you weren't merging onto a freeway or anything like that. It's user-friendly enough. The only other thing, because of its wheelbase, it has a very large turning circle. So parallel parking is not the easiest, but I try and avoid that. You know, if I have to park it, I pull it into a space and be able to pull it out. But beyond that, it has no particular vices. And I think the Tucker did have some vices, and it's right, they didn't get enough development on it. I spoke with Mark Lieberman about that, and he told me the earlier Tuckers are a little better than the later ones, something with the rear suspension or something they did with it. But they're certainly a fascinating car, and I guarantee you if Tucker could have built those, he would have sold them. This was such a futuristic, wonderful thing at the time. It caught everybody's attention. It really did. And I think one of the reasons Coppola made the movie, his father ordered a Tucker and never got it.
And his uncle was a Tucker dealer.
Yeah, he
Tried to be
wanted
a
the
Tucker
car,
dealer.
but he never got it. There are a lot of Tucker radios out there, though.
They, as you probably know, they offered, because the cars were so slow to come into production, they offered radios and seat covers and luggage. And you could buy that in advance. Some people bought them because they thought it moved them up on the list to get a car. And the first time I saw a Tucker radio at Hershey in its original box, I was astounded. It's many years ago, and somebody said to me, no, they made thousands of those damn radios. They just didn't make, they made 51 cars.
You used to always see a new Tucker radio in the box at a swap meet.
Yeah.
Every swap meet had a Tucker radio. I thought about buying one, and then for some strange reason, some practical thing was talking to me, and that just doesn't usually happen very often. You can ask my wife about that.
What else can we answer? Anyone?
Where were these manufactured? Did you mention that?
No, Dearborn, Michigan.
Okay.
You familiar at all with Dearborn? Michigan Avenue, which is Highway 12, runs through Dearborn into downtown Detroit. Well, Telegraph Road, which was a major north-south road, still is today, his engineering building was just south of Michigan on the west side of Telegraph. There's nothing been built on the site that I know of, and as a matter of fact, the footings for what was the building that had the boiler and heater in it are still visible there. But what happened on Telegraph, it was a two-lane road with telegraph poles down the middle, which became quite apparent it was a fundamentally bad idea. So they widened the road, and virtually everything on the west side of the road was then gone. Houses, buildings, whatever were torn down. If you drive there today, you will see lots of garages and an alley, which used to be hidden by the garages and structures on the other side of it. But so Dearborn, Michigan, Detroit, Michigan, same basic thing. And I know the cars, there were always some of them running around that area.
Anything else?
Day.
Well, we've got a moment or two left.
Is it? Forgive me, I was late. I've got a couple questions. Your car, what serial number is it, and how long have you had it?
This is number 4. I bought this car in 1987 and finished the restoration in 1989, about 4 weeks before we left to go on the great race with it. Didn't have much time to think about whether or not I did a good job. We just went.
Done a great job.
Because it's a time-speed distance rally, and you're busy the whole time you're in the car.
Is that an air-cooled engine, or is it radiator?
No, it's a Ford flathead V8, water-cooled. Stout used the engine for, 2 reasons. One, it was one of the most modern engines at the time. They were plentiful, they were relatively inexpensive, and they were very compact. He was always worried about spaces to put things in, because a 6-cylinder engine, which probably would have worked, would have been long. 8-cylinder engine would have been too long. A V12 engine would have also been too big, but the V8 worked. Plus then, if you had one, you could go to any Ford dealer for service.
he had a terrific relationship, it says in the book. Bill Stout and Henry Ford talked a great deal. Henry Ford seemed to take an interest in his projects. He certainly was interested in the aircraft side of things. So, and I think that Stout, well, he literally was a Ford employee for a while, so he probably got a hell of a deal on these flatheads as well.
Probably. Henry Ford and Edsel Ford, a notable thing is that Stout needed money for another invention project, and it was aircraft. And what he did was he sent his famous $1,000 letters to 100 of the most prosperous, well-known, wealthiest people in the Detroit area. And the letter was very simple. He introduced himself, and he was fairly well known by that time because his crazy ideas worked. And the letter was basically, send me $1,000, no more, no less. You owe it to the industry, and I can guarantee you one thing, you'll never see your money again. Well, Edsel Ford subscribed to that. He convinced his father to, and actually, I believe he got 130 checks.
Yeah.
He only asked for 100.
He did.
So Ford got very interested, and Ford built the factory and the airport where the planes were built. But in 1926, Ford wanted to buy the company. So he told Stout, I want to buy the company, but I want to buy the whole company, which means buying all the stock. So Stout was tasked with the job of now unselling the idea to the investors so Henry Ford could buy the company, which he did. And then he kept Stout on to promote aircraft because this was going to be a big deal. Henry Ford really believed in airplane travel because he said it'll shrink the world and we'll all know more about what goes on. So that's when Stout developed Stout Airlines, which I think became part of TWA. I think that's where it went at that time. But when there were other more modern aircraft available, then Henry Ford gave it up. But he said we learned a lot. And the Ford Airport was very modern. Had an air-conditioned terminal building, had the first paved runways, used the first radio beacons to guide planes in inclement weather, and had a dirigible mooring mast that they used once, and then tore it down in 1946. But the Ford Airport today is one of the Ford proving grounds. The other one, I think, is Arizona, I think is where it is in the desert. Yep. And then, of course, in 1931, he built the Dearborn Inn as the world's first airport hotel to service air travelers. And then he custom-made 6 Ford passenger buses with a special radiator shell that said Fordson, because that was Fordson tractor, to transport people around from the airport to the Dearborn Inn, which I've stayed at many times. It's one of my favorite hotels. The other one is Hotel Hershey for some strange reason. Mm-hmm. But it's very historic, and it's some of the maids at the Dearborn Inn claim that Henry Ford walks the halls. They're sure he does. I don't know if he does. I've never seen him, but they say some things go on there. But I suppose he believed in reincarnation, so maybe he does walk the halls.
Any other questions?
I was just going to ask about the Ford engine and drivetrain. How many other parts and what percentage of the car is made by Ford Motor Company?
Well, Ford made the engine, they made the transmission, they made the differential. Now, the transmission is modified, the top shift cover is modified because the engine's in the car backwards. And if you look at it, there's a fan. The fan is on a shaft that goes through the radiator core to the crankshaft. So the engine is backwards because from the clutch, it has a sprocket with a 6-row chain that drops down to the input shaft on the transmission. Transmission is then coupled to the Ford differential center section. And this comprises the drivetrain in virtually no more length than the engine itself. Makes it very compact. Window handles, some other handles.
Taillights.
Taillights are Ford. Yep. Ignition lock is Ford. Some other smaller pieces. The brakes are Bendix as used on Lincoln Zephyr, which is Ford. Steering gear is Ross. Ross made steering gears for a lot of different vehicles. There's other parts from production cars, and this took a while to figure out. The bumpers are 35 Pontiac rear. The instrument cluster is 35 Studebaker, which was pretty Art Deco. Studebaker did a lot of streamlined Art Deco things. The steering wheel is also Studebaker. The chassis, the suspension, all of that was built by Stout. The frame, the rear suspension, the front suspension uses coilover struts like an aircraft. They're very much like McPherson, but McPherson struts today are also a shock absorber. Well, this has separate airplane-style tubular shocks, which I don't know of any other cars at the time that use that. They're actually Delco. The two front shocks are original on the car. They still function fine. But they also have filler plugs that put oil in them if you have to. So it was a clever thing. The wheels are Ford. The hubcaps are Ford, but with an overlay and a Scarab emblem to cover the V8 to give it its own identity. I had one sample of those, and we had them made by a company that made other emblems and such for the antique car hobby. One of the people who worked for Stout, I met him in 1992. He was born the week the Wright brothers flew. He was a fabricator. And I was anxious to meet him because he could tell me a lot of things. So when I met him, as he shook my hand, he pressed into my hand something, and I looked at it. He had one of the original Scarab emblems that were struck for use in printing, where you'd make a printing plate. So they were made out of bronze, and they were struck for the car. His job was to very carefully compound curve them to fit the hubcap, and then they were chrome plated and painted. So there's an NOS brand new old stock Scarab part. You just don't find those things. And he was funny. He said, "I've had this in my desk all these years." He said, "You should probably have it." So I had good conversations with him. I actually interviewed him for an oral history that has yet to be delivered to the Benson Ford Research Center. It will one day. We've still been trying to sort this whole thing out. But he was kind of funny. He had to be about 6'2". He stood straight up, walked straight as an arrow, had a good firm handshake, very knowledgeable. His name was Walker Morrow. He wrote a book too, which is called The Child of the 20th Century. And it's a very good read. He wrote one book about his experiences growing up, gives you a really good idea of what it was to grow up, from in the early teens until and into his working life. And it was kind of funny. In 1992, born in 1903, he was getting on a bit. And we were supposed to take the car out of the Henry Ford Museum where it had been for 2 years. So I called him to tell him, and I said, "We're going to get it out, and we're going to get it running, and we're going to go for a ride, and I want to take you for a ride." And he says, "I'll be there." So he came down, and he said to me, I'm going to be getting married just before that. I said, "Really?" I said, "Good for you." "Yeah." He said, "I kind of need someone to look after me." She was, 60, quite a bit younger than he was. I said, "Well, I don't want to interfere with your wedding or honeymoon." And he said, "Oh, don't worry." He said, "At my age, there's very little honeymoon stuff going on." So we went for a ride. We took 2 long rides around the whole property in the car. And I asked him too, I said, "What did you think? Did we do a good job? Is it the way it should be?" He says, "Looks like I remember them." And I said, "What parts did you actually make?" "Well," he said, "I made the headlight grills." I said, "Would you like to make another pair for me?" He said, "No." But curiously enough, they're multi-piece and they're chrome plated. And of course, we have the problem, they have to be soldered together after they're chrome plated, which is a bit of a trick. And I had a fellow who did some work for me, and he said, "I think I can do this." And he did. He has got to come up with the right solder. So I asked Walker Morrow, I said, "What kind of solder did you use to solder those together?" And he said, "Silver bearing solder," which melts at a fairly low temperature. So when I got home, I asked the guy who did the soldering, I said, "What kind of solder did you use?" He said, "Silver bearing solder." So we had guessed that right, but it was good to hear this from the guy who actually was there. He did a lot of trim items and fabricating, and He went off on his own in a company making things. He was also a pilot. He was a very active pilot. I think at that time, if you had any interest in things or in the industries, you probably were a pilot or wanted to be and whatnot, because that really was an interesting period in time. Of course, Stout embraced it wholeheartedly. And of course, with the tri-motor, the 3 motors gave people more confidence in this contraption. 1 motor, iffy. 2 motors, that's good. But 3 motors, we're covered. Everything works. Because on the tri-motor, it'll fly on 2, and you can maintain some altitude on 1, give you enough time to find a place to put the thing down should it happen. But I don't know of any failures on Ford tri-motor airplanes as far as something falling apart or falling off. And they are a really wonderful design. But everything Stout did had some relevance to aircraft. He even worked on a stainless steel airplane to be spot welded together instead of riveted. Well, stainless steel lasts forever in virtually any kind of environment. So he thought, now we have an airplane that'll really last. But the problem was airplanes flex, they move. And in this case, it flexed enough to break the spot welds, so that they abandoned that idea. He also worked on the flying car, which was an interesting project too.
So I hate to stop, but we're kind of at 8:15, so we've run our course. But I want to thank all of you for coming, and really thank Ron for his insights and thoughts and just wonderful knowledge about this car.
So thanks everybody for attending. If you want, we'll turn up the lights and you can come down here, take some pictures with the car, and maybe ask a couple of questions that you didn't get answered earlier. But thanks everybody for attending. We'll see you at the next event. And I think Tom has one more thing.
We did have one request if we could open up to see the engine area as we get closer to the end.